Okay everyone, hello again, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about focus. So focus, there's nothing in there. Focusing your camera, how does it do it? What focus modes to use? Why is it important? Obviously it's important, we want our subject to be in focus. So let's get right to it. This is how your camera focuses, and stay tuned to how best to use each focus mode. Enjoy. So before we go into focus modes, which one to use, we need to understand how our camera focuses. Photography's come a long way from where it used to be and how it used to focus. Historically, we used to have to manually focus. Now what that does, like autofocus, is it brings together or pushes apart focus elements that bring the focal point closer towards the camera or further away. Autofocus is a fairly new thing. The first autofocus systems worked similar to a rangefinder. It would show a ghost image of what you're seeing alongside the image when you look through the viewfinder, and by rolling the focus ring you would bring that ghost image to where it aligned with your image. When it aligned, the image was in focus and you took the picture. Now our automated systems do that for us, but match in the same way. Modern day autofocus systems can be split into two processes: active and passive. Active systems, which are slowly going out of date, work on shooting a beam, an infrared beam, you can't see the beam, towards your subject, and then measuring the time it took for that beam to bounce back and hit your camera. By measuring the time, the camera can measure the distance and move the focus elements accordingly to bring that subject into focus. It takes a little bit more time, and like I said, those systems are slowly going out of date. So we're going to focus on passive systems. Passive can further be split into two different processes: contrast detection and phase detection. It's important to know both because both have advantages and both have disadvantages. And most DSLRs, and in fact mirrorless cameras, will have both phase detection and contrast detection as an option. The good thing about contrast detection is it is more accurate. How contrast detection works: the camera will focus the image according to how much contrast is over your focal point. Remember, detail and contrast are synonymous. In fact, it could be described that it's the same thing. Detail is micro contrast. So if there's not a lot of contrast over your focal point, the camera will move the focal elements back and forth and will move the focus point back and forth over your subject. In that moment, it will measure the point at where the micro contrast is most significant. The more blur, the less contrast. The sharper it is, the more micro contrast. So when it figures out where the most micro contrast exists, that is your point of focus. It happens very quickly, but it's not quite as quick as phase detection, and that's one of contrast detection's drawbacks, is it takes a little bit longer. The good thing about it is you never have to calibrate it according to a lens, which sometimes happens with phase detection. Each lens could fall out of its optimum focal point, and because of the focus hunting over that point, it's slightly slower, but it is more precise than phase detection. So it has its place, especially in landscape photography or portraiture, where your scene is relatively still and nothing is moving too fast. It's definitely a better option to use. Let's look at phase detection. Phase detection is the most commonly used way of focusing, although it does have a small drawback, which means with a different lens, it can fall out of alignment. It's rare, but if it happens, you simply have to recalibrate your lens. So let's look at how phase detection works. Now, with a DSLR, you have your mirror which bounces light up into what's called your pentaprism and through your viewfinder. Below that mirror is an autofocus module. There's a little section on the mirror that lets a little bit of light through, a little translucent section on that mirror that lets a little bit of light through and hits another mirror, which splits that light into two different paths that go through another element in your autofocus module that angles those two paths of light towards each other again. But in the path of those two beams of light is your autofocus sensor, which is made up of vertical AF points, cross-type AF points, or dual-type cross AF points. And what those AF points do is read those two paths of light. And if those two paths of light do not align with each other, in other words, if they do not converge exactly on each other, giving the exact same pattern of light, it means the image is not aligned. We must remember that the light measured by a sensor can actually be seen as a pattern. Certain pixels absorb more light, which make the charge heavier, which make it brighter, and some pixels absorb less light, which make it darker. Those dark and bright areas can be seen as peaks and valleys, darks being valleys and brights being peaks. Now, those two beams of light that have been split in your autofocus module, when they hit your autofocus sensor, if those peaks and valleys don't line up, the image is out of focus. So all the autofocus sensor needs to do is measure the distance between those two patterns and bring them together and align them. In the autofocus sensor, you have vertical AF points, which can record the offset from a vertical perspective. The only problem about cameras that only have vertical AF points is that if there's vertical lines that even when offset align up with each other, it means the camera will not recognize it as out of focus. So better cameras have cross-type AF points, which not only measure the offset from a vertical perspective, but also from a horizontal perspective, which means it can recognize the offset even if there's vertical patterns that align with each other, even if they're offset. Even better than that, in modern cameras, you get dual-type cross AF points, which measure the offset on a third dimension, which means it's very unlikely that the sensor will not be able to recognize the offset and the distance between the offset, and can bring that gap together and focus the image. With mirrorless systems, face detection works the same way. If I were to take this off, as we've discussed in a mirrorless system before, the light's hitting a single sensor. There's no mirror bouncing it through a prism. Neither is there another mirror bouncing it into an autofocus module. The same process of phase detections happens on the same sensor. The autofocus plane and the image plane happen on the same sensor. The nice thing about this in a mirrorless camera being on the same sensor is you don't have a problem with calibration. With mirrorless systems, because the focus plane and the image plane is on the same sensor, that doesn't happen. Fuck is this thing? So now we've looked at how focus happens, how your camera achieves focus. Now we're going to look at different focus modes, actual options in your camera to optimize how your system focuses. The first two things we need to look at is called sport mode, or AFS, and continuous autofocus, or AI servo. The two are quite different and are suited for different things. AFS, or sport mode, or in some cameras it's called single shot, means that when you focus and you move the position of the camera, that focal point stays in the same place, the same distance from the camera. This comes in handy when you've got a subject that is lying dead still. You can focus on your subject, recompose, take the picture. Where AFC comes in handy, continuous autofocus, or AI servo, is when your subject is moving and you want to track focus. You focus on your subject, you hold your focus in, and you keep taking pictures, and it will stay focused on where your focus point, no matter where that moves. Both of them have a really important role in focusing your camera. This brings me to something called back button focus. There's few things in photography that are finite, that are actually a rule that everyone should obey. Back button focus, as far as I'm concerned, is one of those rules. With the greatest amount of respect, if you're not back button focusing, you are making your life so much harder. Let's explain what back button focus is. This means you're taking the focus out of the shutter button, which with standard cameras, for some reason, God knows why do they still do that? Your shutter button is used both to focus and take the picture. The problem about this is you have to go through the focus function in order to take a picture. What back button focus does is separate those two functions. So instead of having to choose between AFS and AFC when your still subject all of a sudden gets moving, like in wildlife photography, it gives you both those options at your fingertips by separating the focus function from the taking a picture function, from the shutter function. So now your focus function is on the button called AF on. So you've disengaged focus on your shutter button, which means if your subject is still, you can click it with your thumb, focus on it with your thumb, let go, recompose, and shoot as much as you like, and the focus will stay exactly where you left it. If your subject suddenly gets up and walks towards you, you don't have to fumble your settings and try and get onto AFC. You already have it. You just hold the AF on button on and track your subject and take your pictures. If you're not on back button focus yet, you need to get on it. It should be standard with every camera. If you don't know how to do it on your camera, give me a call, because every single camera is different and it can be quite complicated. The next thing we look at is AF area modes and why it's important to use certain ones in certain situations. Well, your camera will give you certain options in terms of AF area modes. And what it simply means is giving you a chance to focus on a specific spot or a wider spot. And it's suitable for different situations. A lot of the time photographers leave their camera on single point autofocus. This means you can precisely choose exactly where you want to focus the camera. So especially if you've got a live subject, a human, an animal, and you want the eyes in focus, you can always put that spot exactly on the eye and you've got a good focus. And then in some cameras, you have the option of going to 4 focus points, 4 active points in the shape of a diamond. Sometimes it's 5. This spreads the area of what you want in focus. Usually you use this for a fast moving subject. You might miss your focus point if you've just got a single point. So it spreads it out. Less room for error, more chance you're going to grab your focal point instead of jumping off your subject. The problem here is if you're shooting portraiture, sometimes it might grab the nose or just above the eyes or the eyebrow instead of actually grabbing the eye itself. So use it for subjects that are moving quite fast and you just need to capture their body, shoulder, head and shoulders, head, but not the eye specifically. Then you can have a single autofocus point, but you can have 8 assist points all around it, which is, again, expanding your area of focus and can be used for faster moving subjects that are even harder to grab their focus, such as a sprinting cheetah or flying birds. And then cameras have a varying amount of how many assist points you can add to your screen. The more difficult it will be to grab focus of your subject, the more assist points that you want. And the number can vary. And in today's cameras, you have the option of auto, which will simply focus on the closest thing to you. Or you have 3D tracking, like in some of the Nikon systems, which will find areas of high contrast, the highest contrast, and will focus on those points. If you're unsure on which focus point to use, you're going to be good with single point most of the time because you want to keep a precise focus point. If your subject's moving fast, go to 4 active points or 1 point with 8 active assist points. Now that we know what AF area modes are, in today's cameras, you also get to choose how many points in your viewfinder you can assign to your AF area modes. Why would this make sense? Wouldn't you want all of them all at once at all times? Not necessarily the case, although that is convenient. It means you can move your focal point to anywhere in the screen, which is great. The problem comes in when you want to do it quickly, especially in wildlife photography. Picture your subject going one way. You want your focal point to be in a specific place. According to your compositional rules, you need a certain amount of space in one side of the frame. So your focal point needs to be on the other side of the frame. All of a sudden, your subject turns around. If you've activated all of your focus area, you have to click across frantically on your button to get your focus point to the other side. It might take too long. By that time, you've missed your shot. Where, if you can choose, and in some cameras, you can say 11 focal points or 51 focal points, 120 active focal points, which will probably be the whole frame. If you choose less, if you choose 11, it means you only have to click 2 or 3 times. Your focal point has moved to the other side of the frame, and now you can recompose and keep taking the picture. So it's important to know how much of your frame is going to be active and usable with your focus point. A lot of cameras will also give you the option of an AF lock, an autofocus lock. And what that allows you to do is lock onto your focus point for a certain amount of time, 1 second, half a second, 2 seconds. And the purpose of this is if you're tracking a subject and you're focusing on that subject and something passes between you and your subject, it can ruin your focus and focus on the thing that's between you and your subject now. So an AF lock system can help you with that, meaning if something passes between you and your subject, it will continue to focus at that distance at where it last saw your subject for 1 second or 2 seconds. And in that time, you could have passed what was blocking you from your subject and you haven't lost focus. The problem with this is it often takes a lot of time to reacquire focus if you do lose it. But if you're shooting a bird through a forest and there's lots of trees that might come between you and your subject, an AF lock mode might help you. So that's focus. That's how it works inside your camera. That's the focus mode. Now you need to remember that every camera has different options for focus modes. They're quite similar in a way. They're often called different things. So you need to do some research as to what focus mode your camera has and what they mean, especially in today's day where you get some very interesting focus modes like animal eye detection. This is an incredibly powerful tool that can actually recognize the eye of an animal and hold that focus no matter where the animal goes, as long as that eye is within view. As well as face detection software, which can recognize the shape of a face of a human or an animal and hold onto that face and keep the focus there, which makes our focusing life much, much, much easier. Not all cameras have these modes. Most of them will have the ones I've previously mentioned in this video, which are good. People have been using those modes for a long time and getting great images. If you don't have animal eye or face detection software in your camera, it doesn't matter. Just use the good old faithfuls and you'll do just fine. That's focusing. I hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time.